Well, welcome members and fellow pilots. We have a briefing here. We thought we'd put together detailing the changes that are upcoming for us for the Sydney Basin. These come into effect on July 9th this year. It's a significant change. The changes affect the major airports in the Sydney Basin. For us on the GA side, that'll be Bankstown and Camden. And there are significant changes to both the lateral and vertical limits of different airspaces, as well as the procedures in and out of Bankstown, as well as elsewhere throughout the basin. Just some very brief summaries of what we're looking at here. The Sydney Basin has now been reclassified largely as overlying Class Charlie airspace, but underneath that will be Class D throughout the entire basin. So the OCTA or Class G airspace that was there before will be disappearing. It'll be largely Class Delta. Initially, Air Services and CASA were calling it Delta Plus. They're just calling it Class Delta now, but this Delta airspace will require a transponder, whereas in other Delta airspace you'll encounter it's not a requirement. The Sydney Basin can't be navigated outside controlled airspace at all, really, unless you're a helicopter and you can get down quite low legally. The only way to pass through the Sydney airspace now without needing a clearance and a transponder code will be to navigate via the Victor 1 lane coastal past Sydney, which will remain largely unchanged. So transponder required, and there will be flight plans required before getting a clearance into the airspace, and you will need a code to get yourself in and out of Bankstown, Camden, or through the Sydney Basin in general. Just before I continue, I just wanted to note that as this is a large overhaul of the Sydney airspace, it's still a work in progress. Air Services Australia and CASA will advise of any changes through their AIP SUP and NOTAMS services as the situation evolves. Nothing in this briefing removes the need for pilots to conform to the latest requirements and use the latest available documents, including relevant charts, GPS databases up to date, as well as your EFB data up to date, and as I said, the AIP SUP and NOTAMS. The Central Coast Aero Club and or Warnervale Air will not be held liable for any errors arising from this briefing we're doing here today. As I said, the situation may evolve and this may go out of date pretty quickly. Now, probably the biggest change is with respect to Bankstown Airport. Bankstown's been significantly changed, both in terms of the procedures that we use and the airspaces in and out. Just quickly, the big picture of those changes in a very general sense, and then we're going to go into it in much more detail. Before, a VFR pilot arriving at Bankstown generally tracked via one of the published VFR lanes, that was via Brooklyn Bridge to Prospect, or coming back the other way via Hornsby back to Patonga. Or you could also enter from the south towards 2RN or Prospect from the west. We would report at the visual reporting points such as Prospect or 2RN, then from there contact Bankstown Tower, receive joining instructions and enter the CTR. On departure, we announced our intentions with a ready call, departed by an extended circuit leg and left the CTR via whatever route we thought was most appropriate. And then possibly via one of those lanes. If we're going northbound, it'd be via the Hornsby to Patonga lane. And then we change back to Sydney Centre once clear. Under the new procedures, a VFR pilot arriving at Bankstown must first of all lodge a flight plan. You would need to obtain an airways clearance from Centre prior to Class Delta and obtain a transponder code. Enter the Bankstown Class D CTA, use a coded inbound clearance, communicate with Bankstown approach, and then transfer to tower near the CTR boundary. So there's three controllers you'll be talking to on the way in. On departure, you will need to request a specific coded outbound clearance, and prior to that, actually, you'll need to get a clearance before engine start, actually, on the way out. You'll need to follow a prescribed track after takeoff, contact Bankstown approach once you leave the CTR, and then you follow one of the coded clearances outbound until released at the edge of the CTA boundary. We'll go through those in far more detail now. So just to reiterate what we used to do very quickly, we would arrive from the Bankstown, from Warnervale, from the northern side here, we would track down towards Brooklyn Bridge, and we would remain outside controlled airspace all the way down to Prospect. So we stay below the Class Charlie step of 2,500 feet. We would follow this prescribed VFR lane, and we would get our clearance inbound to Bankstown, which was what was known as an abbreviated Class D airspace at Bankstown. And inbound at the prescribed altitudes depending on the runway in use. So we had 1,000 feet inbound to runway 11 or 1,500 via 29er. It was a lot freer than what the airspace is going to be. So there was no need to talk to air traffic control until approaching Prospect. Of course, we want to get our ATIS back here somewhere as well. Just before I go on, just want to add that, as I mentioned earlier, it's an evolving situation. The AIP SUP H8426 has now amended the current ERSA for July 9 and Sydney VTC to show different heights for some of those lanes in and out. The reason they did this is they've unfortunately very late to the party here, but they've noticed that the altitude you'd be flying inbound up the Brooklyn inbound lane and outbound via the Mt Annan outbound gets you a little bit too close to terrain. In fact, in some places would put you contrary to Part 91 and the minimum heights you're allowed to fly over populated areas. So they've had to amend some of those heights. Unfortunately, the VTCs and ERSA have already been printed for July 9, so the printed versions of those will be incorrect. You need to rely on the AIP SUP and NOTAMS to override those incorrect parts of the VTC and the ERSA. There's also been another SUP just sent out since then. I don't have the number in front of me. It would probably be H85 or somewhere close to that, which details a new VFR lane that is outbound from Bankstown to the southeast called the Woronora outbound. It also doesn't appear on the charts or in the ERSA. So make sure that you are reading the charts, the ERSA, in conjunction with any AIP SUPs or NOTAMs. Okay then, so on to the new procedures. So we'll start off with arrivals. With your new arrival procedure, first of all, you need a flight plan. You can't get into Bankstown now without one. So all VFR ops into Bankstown Class D CTA require a flight plan. Secondly, you will need a transponder code. So even though it's Class D, you will need a transponder. It's a requirement, unlike most Class D airspaces. Before entering the CTA, you'll need to contact Sydney Centre on 124.55 to receive a discrete transponder code. An example of this call might be Sydney Centre, Charlie November Papa, 5 miles north of Brooklyn Bridge, request code for Brooklyn inbound to Bankstown, receive Bravo. Once you've been given a transponder code by Centre, you'll then need to contact Bankstown Approach. Approaching that first waypoint for us, that would be Brooklyn Bridge. An example there would be Bankstown Approach, Piper Cherokee, Charlie November Papa, Brooklyn Bridge, 1,500, request Brooklyn inbound. Now the tracking requirements for the Brooklyn inbound, which is coming inbound from the north, is to track via Brooklyn Bridge. That's the same as what it used to be. I'll just get my highlighter here. So we've got Brooklyn Bridge, and then we're going to track via Berraleigh. We used to call that the Barrowra Strobe, but now it's known as Berraleigh. There is a strobe there. Then via South Dural Tanks, a new waypoint called Castle Towers, and then another new waypoint called Borkham Hills Reservoir. Doesn't appear here on this VTC excerpt because it is one of the new waypoints that have been introduced with the AIP SUP that I just spoke about. And then from there track to the eastern edge of Prospect Reservoir. We are required to maintain no more than 1,800 feet, well actually at 1,800 feet until Borkham Hills Reservoir, which is sort of between these 2 points here somewhere. And then at that point, we need to be at 1,500 feet by the Borkham Hills Reservoir. So 1,800 down the majority of the lane with a descent to be at 1,500 by Borkham Hills Reservoir, and then from there 1,500 into Prospect. At Prospect, we then contact tower on 132.8, which is the same frequency for inbound outbound operations at Bankstown currently, and then we'll receive the joining instructions as per normal. From there on into Bankstown, it's largely unchanged, very similar to the current procedure. So just to reiterate, up here, prior to reaching Brooklyn Bridge, we need to get a code from Sydney Centre on 124.55. Then we need to contact Bankstown approach after we receive that code at Brooklyn Bridge on 125.8, and then down the lane, and we would then need to contact Bankstown Tower as we're approaching Prospect Reservoir for circuit joining instructions and eventually for a landing clearance. The next arrival route is the Light Horse inbound, is the next one from the west. The requirements for this one are to track via the Nepean Bridge initially, which currently is the initial waypoint inbound to track the Richmond VFR lane. So they're using that now as the inbound Light Horse, or the Light Horse inbound track into Bankstown. So Nepean Bridge, then we track via the M4, and we want to keep the M4 on our right all the way along here. You can see the M4, if I just track along there with the highlighter, the laser pointer, you'll see that runs largely alongside the purple dots of our Light Horse inbound track. We've got to keep that on our right hand side because of Western Sydney CTR. So Western Sydney CTR running around here, you can see on this top corner here, basically butts right up against that VFR lane. So if you're right of the M4, you'll be infringing the Western Sydney CTR, and it's not going to be taken too kindly by the controllers or CASA. As you track along the M4, we're looking for the Light Horse interchange, and then from the Light Horse interchange, we then track direct for the eastern edge of Prospect Reservoir, and then we're back to where we were, like for the Brooklyn inbound. We're going to contact tower on 132.8. So our next arrival route is the St Helens inbound from the southwest. On this one, we are down here starting our journey at St Helens Skate Park. Can only assume these waypoints are easy to see from the air. CASA are going to release an on-track video series as well as visual depictions of all these waypoints, like they do on the current Sydney Basin guide, etc. So we can only assume they are fairly easy to see from the air. So St Helens Skate Park to Campbelltown Railway Station, and along the lane there to the Crossroads Shopping Centre. It's 2,500 feet initially, but you must descend to be at 1,500 by the Crossroads Shopping Centre. At Crossroads, we're going to contact tower on 132.8 for our inbound instructions as per the other inbound routes. You want to keep the Hume Highway on your left-hand side, very important. So if I just run the laser pointer here along the Hume, you'll see that runs along there. The Hume Highway basically bisects the inbound and outbound tracks here and here. So we've got the St Helens inbound and the Mt Annan outbound, which we'll talk about shortly. They are very, very close. So it's important that you keep the Hume Highway on your left-hand side on both of those routes to make sure that you're separated from oncoming traffic. Okay, onto the departures side of things now. Just quickly, our old departure procedure for revision, if we were northbound, we would track out via Parramatta CBD and then on to Pennant Hills and then Hornsby. Once we're at Hornsby, we would continue along the lane to track either out to the coast via around 085 degrees magnetic, or onto Patonga at the end of the lane, and then we're back out of the VFR lane, and we could track as required. So general VFR departures out of Bankstown initially, you would extend a circuit leg. Tower clearance constituted an authority to leave the CTR, and we would just change to Sydney Centre approximately 3 miles out from Bankstown without having to talk to tower. The new departure procedures, we are required to contact initially Bankstown ground on 119.9, same frequency as what we currently use, but prior to taxi with our intention for an airways clearance. So that would be before engine start. So an example there, Bankstown ground, Cherokee Charlie November Papa, request the Hornsby outbound and taxi, receive Bravo. And we would then receive our transponder code and instructions to taxi. So we would taxi via those instructions, giving way to any aircraft vacating a runway as is required at Bankstown. And then we would make our ready call. The ready call probably has even more importance now than what it did before, because you're going to be telling them about basically the tower controller now on 132.8, which outbound you're intending to follow. So an example there would be, Charlie November Papa ready, runway 11 left for the Hornsby outbound. Okay, so on to our individual departure routes. We'll talk about the requirements just after takeoff in a moment. We'll start off with the actual tracking requirements on each of the routes outbound, and then we'll move on to those initial departure requirements after takeoff. So the first one we'll talk about is the Hornsby outbound, probably most relevant for us pilots here at Warnervale. That's the one that takes us back to our home here. So after departure, first of all, once we leave the CTR, whereas before we would just change back over to Sydney Centre and just monitor the frequency, we need to now actively contact Bankstown approach on 125.8. So the CTR boundary, you can see here at Bankstown, runs along about here somewhere. So once we cross that point there, we need to contact Bankstown approach for onwards flying. We're going to track via Parramatta like we did before. Now there's a slight kink to what we currently do. We're going to go up to a new waypoint called Muirfield Golf Club. From there, we're going to another new waypoint, which doesn't appear here on the chart, unfortunately, but it's Carlingford Corner, which is near the Pennant Hill Strobe there, I think, or just before that. Then onto the Pennant Hill Strobe, off to Hornsby, and then from Hornsby up to Parramatta like we currently do. We need to maintain 1,500 feet once we depart the CTR until Carlingford Corner, which is this new waypoint in here somewhere. And then from Carlingford Corner we can climb to 1,800 feet for the remainder of the track up to Patonga. Once we leave Class D CTA, then control services and identifications terminated, we can squawk 1200, and frequency changes then approved to monitor the area frequency or a CTAF. The next outbound we're going to talk about is the Penrith outbound. That's to the west. Once again, after departing the CTR, we need to contact Bankstown approach on 125.8. We're going to track via, once again, Parramatta initially. So the outbound for the Penrith and the Hornsby outbound both initially track to Parramatta. Then from there, we're going to turn left and track to Seven Hills train station. Then on along this VFR lane out to Victoria Bridge, which is just north of the Nepean Bridge, which, as you recall, is the start of the Lighthorse inbound track. So once again, these two are fairly close together, so just be careful of oncoming traffic. In terms of altitudes, this one is flown at 1,500 throughout the entire procedure. Once you leave the Class D CTA over here, once again, control and ID services terminated, squawk 1200 and frequency change is approved. The next outbound route we're talking about here is the Mt Annan outbound. That basically tracks down to the southwest. So once again, leaving the CTR, we need to contact Bankstown approach on 125.8. We're going to track via the intersection of the M7 and Hoxton Park Road. That's another new waypoint. And another new waypoint, these are all new waypoints down here, Edmondson Park Railway Station, Edmondson Park Station, I should say. And we track via the Hume motorway. Once again, like I said earlier, we need to keep that on our left to keep clear of the St Helens inbound traffic. We're going to maintain, and then from that Edmondson Park Station, we track via the Hume on the left-hand side until we reach the Mt Annan Gardens Greenhouse waypoint. In terms of altitudes, we're going to be 1,500 feet until we get to Edmondson Park Station. From there we can climb to 2,500 for the remainder of the track down to Mt Annan Gardens. Leaving the CTA, once again, our ID and control services terminated with squawk 1200 and frequency change is approved. The last outbound is a recent addition. This one only appears in that AIP SUP, and it's an outbound only. There's no corresponding inbound for this one. And it actually takes you through what used to be Sydney CTR. They've had to amend the Sydney CTR a little bit to fit this one in. We're going to track, once again, passing the the Bankstown CTR boundary. We need to contact Bankstown approach on 1258. Going to track via Revesby Station, Casuarina Oval, and then the Woronora Cemetery. Once you get clear of the Woronora Cemetery, you're going to be leaving the CTA, and then we need to, once again, where our control service is terminated, and we can squawk 1200. Frequency change is approved to the area frequency. Just be very careful tracking down along here. It's running right alongside the Sydney CTR boundary. They've actually pushed that boundary in to fit this in, and they've put it as close as they can to it. So you're running right along the edge there. If you're left of track down here, you will be in the CTR, and you will hear about it, no doubt. So be very careful. Okay, so they're the prescribed or coded clearance tracks, but there are some requirements on initial departure once you get airborne to get to the first waypoint on those tracks. So the runway-specific departure tracks, some of them are very similar to what we do now, but runway 29er, if you're going out to Parramatta, we're going to maintain runway heading, climb to 500 initially, then it'll be a right turn to Parramatta, climbing to 1000. Once you clear the pipeline, which runs east-west north of Bankstown, we'll be climbing to 1500. If we're going out to Parramatta via runway 11, we're going to maintain runway heading till 500 feet, left turn direct Parramatta and climb to 1500. And from there, you follow your prescribed coded clearance. If we're going out via Mt Annan using runway 29, it'll be runway heading to 1000 feet, left turn when we cross the Hume motorway, climb then to 1500 and proceed to the M7 Hoxton Park Road intersection, and then out via the Mt Annan procedure. If we're going out to Mt Annan via runway 11, we'll be turning onto downwind after 500 feet's achieved, track via the Dunk Grey Velodrome, maintain then 1500 out to the start of the Mt Annan outbound at the Hoxton Park Road intersection. In all cases, once you leave that Bankstown CTR, once again, contact Bankstown approach on 125.8. If you're going out via Warnervale, whether it's runway 29 or 11, there's no prescribed tracking per se. They're just basically at this stage are saying to follow, telling us to follow ATC instructions. Okay, so they'll give you individual instructions if you want to go out via that route. And then once again, leaving the CTR over to Bankstown approach on 125.8, you need to make contact with them. Okay, so that's Bankstown. We'll just have a quick chat about the Basin, Sydney Basin generally. First of all, it appears at this stage that ad hoc tracking, well, it doesn't appear, it's going to be the case that ad hoc tracking clearances will be unavailable through the Sydney Basin. So there's no Class G airspace at altitudes that are usable. So we can't just track wherever we like anymore and watching out for traffic. And it's probably highly unlikely that you're going to get clearances that are largely different to those coded clearances we spoke about in and out of Bankstown. Because of the proximity of Sydney to the east, Western Sydney to the west, and Richmond to the northwest, pretty busy airspace. And you can always ask, and you may be given a different clearance, but it's probably mostly not going to happen. So basically, don't think transit the Bankstown CTR or Sydney Basin, think transit the Bankstown CTA or Sydney Basin via a coded VFR route. The old practice of routing via Parramatta, Prospect to Bankstown area, then to the west wherever you feel is appropriate, and simply talking to or monitoring the relevant tower or controller has been replaced by a more structured system around Bankstown. The new Class D CTA uses published VFR lanes, transponder codes, and Bankstown approach. We'll just have a typical example of transiting that airspace if we're not landing at Bankstown. So we wanted to go north to south. It's a fairly common occurrence for us here at Warnervale. So we wanted to go to Canberra, for example. Assuming your VMC and no Sydney CTR clearance is required, we're going to depart Warnervale and track south towards Brooklyn Bridge. Prior to entering the Bankstown CTA, we need to contact Sydney Centre and obtain that discrete transponder code we spoke of earlier. At Brooklyn Bridge, we contact Bankstown Approach and request the appropriate coded clearance. For a Canberra flight, the most likely routing would be Brooklyn inbound via and then onto a Mt Annan outbound. I'll just simply link those two coded clearances together. So this effectively takes us Brooklyn Bridge down to Prospect and then from Prospect out to the Mt Annan outbound. There may be an opportunity to go from Prospect straight to the Hoxton Park Road waypoint, but Air Services Australia have indicated they may require you to overfly Bankstown Airport at 1,500. We're not quite sure yet, so it looks like it will either be down the Brooklyn inbound and then over to Hoxton Park Road and then Mt Annan outbound, but there may be a section between Prospect and Hoxton Park Road there where they require you to overfly Bankstown Airport to do the full procedure. So an actual clearance might sound something like Charlie November Park, cleared Brooklyn inbound, then Mt Annan outbound, but the precise phraseology and routing will depend on ATC. Just a final note, just remember you're in controlled airspace throughout, so you must conform to any clearances, whether they be coded or given by ATC more specifically, like a bespoke clearance. However, you always have the right to request higher levels if you believe it operationally necessary, and ATC will clear you for that if they can with regards to traffic flow. Air Services Australia have been very vocal about this. They've mentioned it several times that they understand that we're closer to terrain than we used to be, and that requesting higher levels, if you feel it's operationally necessary, is something you can always do. For example, if you wanted to request 2,500 for the entirety of the Brooklyn inbound, that's fine. You may not get it, but it's always okay to ask. Fly safe, obviously. Speak to one of our instructors if you have any questions, and don't be afraid to ask for a dual flight in and out of Bankstown for familiarity if you feel it's necessary, regardless of your experience level. Also, check out CASA's Airspace briefings on their YouTube channel, which is at CASA Briefing. They did some industry briefings. There's some good questions and feedback on there. They've got representatives from Air Services Australia and CASA, and it's worthwhile checking that out as well. And once again, this is purely for education purposes. Take it with a grain of salt because the situation's evolving, but hopefully you've got some useful information out of this. But always be sure to check the latest NOTAMS and AIP SUPs for any changes to what we've outlaid today. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you up in the air soon, hopefully.